Prince of Persia's The Lost Crown was not on my bingo card of great games to experience inside of 2024. Not only am I rarely interested in platformers, but the reveal trailer that debuted in June of 2023 didn't exactly help either. And while this wasn't due to the fact that the trailer looked bad or anything like that, but the murmurings from the crowd swayed my opinion negatively when longtime fans said that this game was going to be awful. And while I agree with those fans of this series that the core identity of Prince of Persia was stripped from this current iteration, I actually quite disagree that this game is terrible, and I would argue that it's one of the better games in the Metroidvania genre that I have personally played in a while. Would a brand new 3D single player experience be a great addition to the Prince of Persia lexicon? Of course it would, and you won't find me pushing against that. And as surprising as it was to see Ubisoft Montpellier create a 2.5D side-scroller with the Prince of Persia IP, despite the immense backlash, they stuck to their guns and delivered a solid package. Are you going to find AAA storytelling like God of War or top-tier world building like Cyberpunk 2077? Of course not. But what you will find is an expertly crafted combat and progression system, beautifully curated level design, and many other classic gameplay mechanics which you have played before but are just executed in a superb manner that keeps pulling you back in again and again. I really want to express just how much I appreciate what Ubisoft did with The Lost Crown, because so often we find developers trying to push boundaries and make promises that they can rarely deliver on. But that isn't the case here. The devs never promised a 40 to 60 hour campaign or some sprawling open world, nor did they use all of those typical buzzwords you hear when marketing campaigns typically begin. But instead, they played their cards close to their chest and didn't overextend themselves. But what do I mean by that? Well, after the year of 2023, there were enough big AAA blockbusters to fill up a backlog 1,000 times over, and that can become exhausting. And while I enjoy pushing through games like The Last of Us or Resident Evil 4 Remake, not every game has to have you firing at all cylinders constantly. And while The Lost Crown is somewhat generic, I would argue that it's a good thing, as Ubisoft took a tried and true formula and polished its gameplay to almost near perfection. Never did I once feel like The Lost Crown overstayed its welcome, nor did I feel like it was trying to pull any scummy moves with microtransactions. It was just a solid, albeit somewhat predictable, video game, just meant to be played when you want to play it and to be put down when you are finished. So what about the story and the world that The Lost Crown tries to build? Is it any good? Is it a worthwhile narrative to get lost into? Well, to be perfectly honest with you, it's just okay. The story was much better than I initially anticipated, but it isn't exactly anything to write home about. You are playing as Sargon, who is one of the many epic warriors who are part of a group called the Immortals. After defending Persia from a brutal invasion, Sargon is sent to meet with the Queen to celebrate his efforts. Shortly after the celebration of the Immortals' victory, Prince Hassan, the Queen's heir, is kidnapped. Sargon rushes to try and stop the kidnappers from taking the prince, only to realize that it's actually his mentor Anaita who is doing the kidnapping. Before he can stop her from leaving, she casts a spell to summon an enemy to stop Sargon and then flees. The Immortals follow Anaita to Mount Kaf, where they learn that a curse presides over the area, a curse which turns people into monsters and zombies, as well as breaks time so that some people experience days in just a few hours, where for other people, years pass in just a blink of an eye. The Immortals then split up to find Hassan, and along Sargon's journey, he uncovers twists about why the prince was really kidnapped, as well as stumbles upon these magical Simurgh feathers which aid him with the power of the gods in order to stop his foes from overpowering him. And it's a good thing Sargon does find those feathers to up his game every so often, because you will find yourself in a ton of combat encounters throughout your playthrough. And I will say that the combat and movement feels so damn good, and in fact, the entire game loop feels so well designed. The melee feels tight and impactful, the parry system is super straightforward and rewarding, and the fluidity of the movement is the cherry on top as you slide, flip, and dash all over the map. But we will touch on movement a bit later when we get into the level design. But the main reason that this combat is so much fun is that anyone can jump into it and start killing monsters, but it does take some skill to become great at. Is it as deep as learning all of the nuances and combos inside of Street Fighter 6? No, but it isn't just this mindless hack and slash that it appears to be at first glance. Just on a very basic level, if you hold the joystick up and hold an attack, that will provide a different combo set as opposed to simply tapping attack. And when you pair these slight nuances in combat with the parry system, it really can keep you on your toes. To be quite honest with you all, I assumed that the parrying system would be a total gimmick and would have a super generous window to parry against enemies so that anyone could take down a bad guy without really having to try. And while there is a bit of a generous window, the system itself is more flushed out and crucial to the gameplay than you would initially assume. There is a bit of timing the player will have to get used to, as you simply can't parry at the drop of a hat. Players will have to learn how to time things correctly by finishing or pausing their attacks at the right moment so that they can insert a proper parry and stun an enemy. And there are 3 types of attacks which you will have to look out for. A basic attack, which almost can always be parried, a yellow attack, which the player has to time correctly, and if parried will enter an epic attack animation, and lastly there is a red flash attack which cannot be parried at all and must be dodged or avoided. And while the main line of attack and defense is your sword, the player will equip a bow and arrow eventually, as well as a chakram with a boomerang effect. All of your skills are able to be leveled up over time, which encourages the player to learn how to apply different combos while fighting. That way you can get the most out of your upgrades, but we're going to come back to that a little bit later in the video. Sargon will also unlock special abilities early on in the game, which are called Athra. These are able to be charged up through parrying as well as from regularly attacking or killing enemies, and are epic attacks that will destroy nearly everything in your path. There are 3 tiers of Athra as you progress through the game, and you will unlock better and better skills which you can mix and match at your whack whack tree, your main save and recovery point. I know that's a very strange name, but this does give you the chance to customize your battle experience depending on the foes you are encountering at any given time. The meter on the bottom hand right corner of your screen allows you to see if your Athra skill is fully charged and ready to be used or not. If you have a level 1 Athra ability equipped, then you only need to charge the meter up 1 time in order to use it. But if you have a level 3 Athra ability equipped, then your meter will need to be filled up 3 times. But what makes this interesting is the give and take that Ubisoft implemented with this system. You see, if you take damage repeatedly, you will lose some of the progress on your Athra meter, meaning that the player will have to start over at the current meter level by getting successful parries and kills to build it up over again. And while it may seem a bit overkill to make the players fill the Athra meter 3 times to execute these high tier attacks, these abilities are quite powerful, making the risk of parrying bosses and killing enemies worth the investment, as the damage done afterwards is quite detrimental. And combat only enhances as you begin to add and mix the progression system in your favor. And there are essentially 2 methods to improve your character that both work together simultaneously. The first item is Sargon's necklace, which has a set number of slots that are able to be filled with amulets which you pick up from hidden chests and completing other tasks around Mount Kaf. This can be expanded, of course, by finding blank amulet slots, and I think by the end of my playthrough I had around 10 or 11 spaces to hold a combination of different abilities. What's great about these amulets is you can upgrade them by collecting crystals and other rare currencies which you can spend at the blacksmith. Not only are you able to increase the power of your abilities, but you can increase the strength of your swords, bow and arrow, and chakrams. There is also a lovely little old lady where if you have enough credits you can purchase health increases and use those in tandem with the health increases which you will find throughout your playthrough. And again, by the end of the game I had a large amount of health and was able to use specific amulets to increase my health even more so, as well as regain health through parrying, which made certain boss fights so much fun, as I would often be on the brink of disaster, and then just based off of 1 parry it would give me just enough health back and I was able to completely turn the tide. Something I didn't quite expect from The Lost Crown was the amount of enemy variety inside of this game. There are a lot of different enemy types, ranging from light aerial enemies to tanky mini-bosses and everything in between. I loved the attention to detail as Sargon progressed because despite the fact that enemies would be somewhat region-locked, there were overlapping enemy mechanics that would bridge the gaps, allowing Sargon's new abilities to coincide with the new and old enemy types in exciting ways. It was just really smart of the devs to execute things in this way, which allowed to keep things feeling fresh as well as curious since experimentation was most certainly encouraged. I found myself constantly trying to push boundaries or try things in new ways, especially with puzzles and the level design, but it really occurred heavily within the boss battles. So right now we're going to talk about bosses because man, they were easily the highlight of the game for me, particularly the last two. And let's just say there are a ton of boss fights throughout your playthrough as well as these great moments that push you to your limits with either a smaller boss fight or a lockdown section with heavy enemies. These constant surprises were such a joy as there are a dozen or so innocuous moments that were interrupted by a random fight as Sargon was unable to move forward until it was completed, and I personally love this type of game design. It will always work so well when you're going through the monotonous flow of gameplay when all of a sudden it gets injected with a rare moment of absolute and utter adrenaline. Now obviously the main story boss battles are much more choreographed and they are super epic, super fun, and they are always testing and pushing your abilities to the max. And most importantly, they are telegraphed very clearly. Normally games that require the player to parry heavily as the primary mechanic are annoying for me because my brain takes a bit to recognize the patterns from the bosses. And while I can eventually get through them, there is never any consistency on my end. And while I know that is a skill issue, that's just the way it is for me, and I recognize that, and I don't let it take away from the experience from most games that have this system. But in The Lost Crown, I was able to see improvements in real time from every boss encounter, which gave me a new sense of progression that I had never really felt before, especially not in any Metroidvania. And I know that there are tons of Metroidvanias out there, so if you know of any great ones that have great boss fights, let me know in the comments down below. And while I mentioned that there were a handful of fights at the end of the game that were really epic, I think the best boss fight was against Kiana the Forest Queen, which is kind of early in the game, but the sense of progression through that fight was nearly perfect. The subtlety between attacks, the scale of her moveset, as well as the interruption to push Sargon into this red backdrop against random directional encounters, truly top tier stuff where Ubisoft continued to show that they knew exactly what they were doing when designing this game. If you have only watched the trailers for The Lost Crown and thought to yourself that this game just looks like another generic desert palace, I urge you to go in with an open mind. Mount Kaf is truly an interesting place to explore, with dense foliage in its forests, to the dank, dingy depths of the lower sewers, and all the way to the beautiful snowy mountaintops, which will test your skills in a variety of amazing ways. And just like any great platformer or Metroidvania, there are of course going to be secrets or hidden pathways to venture down once you have acquired new skills and abilities. Now, I know that there are many games out there that likely do this exceedingly well. Come to think of it, I remember really enjoying both Ori games quite a bit because of the level exploration. But I will say, Prince of Persia does a really surprising job, especially when it comes to the new gameplay mechanics you unlock later down the line. Things like Sargon's dash and double jump, or his teleporting abilities, make traversing these levels so much damn fun, as it's constantly breathing new life into each section of the game, whether you have been to it before or not. And when these skills are combined with the actual puzzle and level design, it creates such a flow state. I found myself not being able to put the controller down for hours at a time. And let me give you an example as to why. There is a particular set of puzzles in the game that requires Sargon to use his jumps, dashes, and teleporting in such a strange way that at first you're kind of like angry with the game for making you do such a weird and tedious task. But after sitting with it for a minute, you eventually overcome the obstacle and create your own strategy and feel such a sense of relief. And that is truly the common theme here with The Lost Crown. There is just never a dull moment. There was never that instance where I was stuck banging my head against the wall, confused about which direction I was supposed to head because I missed that one weird turn. This game's progression of difficulty, of skills and abilities, of puzzle solving, of really everything was so smooth and expertly crafted. I can't give enough credit to the devs for knowing knowing exactly what they were doing. Ubisoft must have known that they did such a bang-up job with the exploration system that they actually crafted something inside of it that I have personally never seen in a Metroidvania before, which is called the Memory Shard. Now, to be fair, it's just a glorified screenshot system, but I do think it's a nice touch because playing this on a Steam Deck or a Switch, while on the go of course, allows you to not have to keep an ongoing list in your brain while moving through Mount Calf and the many sections of the map. So hopefully you found some use out of it. I know I certainly did, as I was able to screen cap certain areas of the map where I wanted to return again to retrieve a very rare item or unlock a certain chest. And while this system may not be revolutionary in terms of Metroidvanias, it's a nice quality of life feature that I think adds to the value proposition of the Lost Crown. The last thing I want to touch on here before wrapping up is the game's performance and stability, because it was outstanding. I honestly bet you could get this to run on a Game Boy Color if you optimized it heavily enough. And I figured it would run well, but with the current landscape of PC titles being released and hitting a brick wall in terms of stability, I can't say I wasn't a little cautious before clicking the word purchase. But then I tested this game on 4 different machines, 2 of which were laptops, 1 of which was my main desktop PC, and the last machine was of course my Steam Deck OLED. And through a mix of testing from 720p all the way through 4K resolution, we were getting locked frame rates at nearly whatever you set it to. Now of course, the graphics in The Lost Crown aren't exactly Horizon Forbidden West, but it should be noted that the optimization here was taken very seriously and that this game should be able to run on most machines out there. There really isn't a ton to say about Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. It's a game that you have played before, but that isn't always a bad thing. And like I mentioned throughout the video, Ubisoft made the right choice by starting off 2024 with a solid, well-crafted video game to balance the fatigue the industry created from the year prior. While Ubisoft does seem to have their fair share of issues, especially coming up recently, I still think this game earned a bit of goodwill for the developers. But since this is the same team that made the Rayman series, maybe this wasn't exactly a surprise to most of you watching. The developers really did a great job here by sticking to the fundamentals of game design, as that is always a surefire way to make a, well, good video game. There's a reason the classics are a classic for a reason. So when I started to dive into The Lost Crown and realized just how tight this game was, I began to feel an immense level of appreciation for the dev team. And now, since you know everything there is to know about The Lost Crown, why not click this video right here to learn about whether or not this dev team made the right choices in their ventures to bring about an epic sequel to the public.